Welcome to Crossroads. A big scandal unraveling at NPR right now is exposing not just NPR, but even the media establishment, the systems of public-private partnership for censorship, and actually some pretty wild stuff, let's say, about how the media has been censoring people and trying to suppress different narratives. Basically what happened, an NPR senior editor who's since been removed from his job stepped forward to reveal how a form of what's being framed as ideological corruption found its way into NPR, a media company which, by the way, gets a whole lot of taxpayer money. Now, the scandal has gone beyond just NPR, and it's now exposing how government programs, big news outlets, big tech, they have colluded together to create a culture of, ironically, misinformation while using the banner of fighting misinformation as a way to push it. Now, let me show you how it all started. Free Press had this April 9th, and this was written by one of the editors at NPR, came out as a whistleblower. He said this. He said, "We weren't just losing conservatives, we were also losing moderates and traditional liberals. An open-minded spirit no longer exists within NPR, and now, predictably, we don't have an audience that reflects America. That'll be a problem from an openly polemic news organization serving a niche audience, but for NPR, which claims to consider all things, they show all things considered," he said it's devastating both for its journalism and its business model. They are losing the ability to consider all things, and instead they only consider certain things, it seems. Now, further, he notes that, like many unfortunate things, the rise of advocacy took off with Donald Trump. And what's really important here, the process that this individual describes that took place within NPR can be seen as having taken place within most, the corporate media. He notes that as in many newsrooms, his election, Trump in 2016, was greeted at NPR with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and despair. Maybe the screaming at the clouds types you might remember. But he notes that what began as tough, straightforward coverage of a belligerent, truth-impaired president, in his opinion, veered toward efforts to damage or topple Trump's presidency. In other words, the journalists went from just being critical of Trump and engaging what would be considered, still opinionated journalism, or maybe, they don't like the guy, just excusable to an extent. But they went beyond that to enacting a kind of advocacy or like activist type agenda. They were no longer just focused on truth. They become activists under the guise of journalists. Now, he notes further in the persistent rumors that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia over the election became the catnip that drove reporting. He notes that at NPR, we hitched our wagon to Trump's most visible antagonist, Representative Adam Schiff, the guy with the big crazy eyes. He notes that when Mueller found out there was no credible evidence of collusion, because you might remember, right? Adam Schiff was going on the media claiming that he had evidence of Donald Trump colluding with Russia. He was constantly saying it, constantly suggesting that there were things Congress had that they couldn't make public, but you just had to believe him because they had it and they were investigating Trump, and it was so bad they just couldn't show the public. And it turned out the entire thing was a gigantic, massive lie being pushed by activists, not just in the media, not just in the intelligence agencies, but also within the halls of Congress. Members of our own government were lying about the President of the United States while trying to enact investigations and policies to remove the President of the United States from office. I would consider that to be a palace coup. Frankly, I would say that was an actual act of insurrection. The use of false information knowingly to intentionally try to remove a president from office. That should be seen as insurrection. And of course, Adam Schiff did that along with many others. And of course, the journalists like at NPR were repeating all of this. And this editor notes that when the Mueller report, remember Special Counsel Robert Mueller, found no credible evidence of collusion. It was all fake. He notes that NPR's coverage was notably sparse. He notes that Russiagate quietly faded from our programming. It turned out they lied to their audience for years, and when it came out that it was in fact a giant lie, they just kind of tucked that away in the corner like most of the other corporate media. Now, The author goes on to describe other problematic coverage at NPR, because this wasn't just the Trump-Russia hoax. This was a lot of things. He notes that with denying the Hunter Biden laptop, for example. You might remember polling suggested that had Biden voters known that the Hunter Biden laptop is real, they would have not have voted for Joe Biden in enough numbers that the results of the election would have been different. What happened? There was a group of former intel agency heads and so on who wrote a large letter claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop looked like Russian disinformation, piggybacking on what was false information, again trying to frame Donald Trump alongside Russia. The intel agencies jumped on the bandwagon with the fake Russia narrative, a fake narrative that was put in place to remove the president from office, to investigate Trump, to try to undermine his presidency and then kick him out of the presidency, to go against the basic functions of democracy. Again, a palace coup, a coup d'etat happening again within the halls of Congress and the intel agencies. These intel agents wrote this giant letter claiming that the Hunter Biden laptop was just another chapter in that fake scandal they had made up, but the world did not yet know it was fake. And so what happened? News organizations like NPR, according to this individual and many others, got behind the false narrative yet again. It turned out, of course, the Hunter Biden laptop was very real. The intel agents lied about it, and of course did so again in a way that impacted the outcome of the elections. It goes into other things, for example, like NPR following the whole natural origin of COVID narrative, regardless of evidence coming out, for example, about NIH and so on, colluding with Chinese Communist Party laboratories to do what should be, I think, illegal virus research, doing things they can't legally do in the United States, but working with the Chinese Communist Party to do them. And of course, credible evidence suggesting that maybe the origin of COVID was not from the Huanan seafood market, as many people have framed it. The editor notes that the real problem was not just the coverage, though. It was a problem inside of NPR, National Public Radio, as an organization. He notes that the former CEO, John Lansling, came out in 2019 from Voice of America, going again into NPR from one state-run media to another. He notes that the death of George Floyd took place. Take how you want it, whether it was a fentanyl overdose, whether he was killed by a police officer. You decide, right? But NPR went full in with the race narrative, because you might remember that triggered the race riots across the United States. That triggered the burning down of American towns and so on. That triggered, for example, killings and riots and robberies and looting and the whole 9 yards. And it also triggered government reactions that put in place within many corporate organizations, government agencies, and yes, even news agencies, different offices and positions, for example, to ensure that racial equity was taking place. Now, the individual notes that given the circumstances of Floyd's death, it would have been an ideal moment to tackle a difficult question. Is America as progressive as activists claim, right? Beset by systemic racism in the 2020s in law enforcement, education, housing, and elsewhere, he said that we happen to have a very powerful tool for answering such questions: journalism. In other words, under normal circumstances, if there's these allegations that systemic racism is the cause of everything, journalists normally go through a process of reporting, right? The process of reporting is the process of verification. We go out, we try to look for the information, we try to prove, one way or the other. We find out what's true and what's false. But rather than do that, journalists just adopted it as if it were truth, regardless of the facts. And despite facts emerging that would have challenged all the key narratives, many of these so-called journalists just chose to not follow it. The NPR editor notes that journalism that lets evidence lead the way under most cases, right? But he said the message from the top at NPR was very different. They said America's infestation with systemic racism was declared loud and clear. It was a given. Our mission was to change it. In other words, they took the narrative as being an absolute truth regardless of evidence, And based on that acceptance of this absolute truth based on no evidence really, right? If you look at the numbers and the data and stuff, it actually contradicts most of what people are saying. America is not a racist country. We're probably one of the least racist countries on the face of the planet. I'd say, ironically, Western Europe and America are some of the only countries on earth that actually have a problem with racism. If you go to China and so on, you're not going to find that. But he notes, we were told that NPR itself was a part of the problem. In confessional language, he said the leaders, this is again the CEO at the time, of public media, starting with me, the editor, he said, must be aware of how we ourselves have benefited from white privilege in our careers. We must understand the unconscious bias we bring to our work and interactions, and must commit ourselves, body and soul, to profound changes in ourselves and our institutions. He notes that he, Lansling, the former CEO at NPR, declared that diversity on our staff and in our audience was the overriding mission, the North Star of the organization. And he adds that phrases like, that's part of the North Star, became part of meetings and casual conversations. Race and identity became paramount in nearly every aspect of the workplace at NPR. He notes that journalists were required to ask everyone they interviewed their race, their gender, their ethnicity, among many other questions. Again, kind of nonsense for a lot of Americans because, frankly, I think a lot of Americans are like me. You're probably multiracial. A lot of Americans are mixed. But regardless, he said they had to enter all this data into a centralized tracking system. And notes that we were given unconscious bias training sessions, a growing DEI staff, diversity, equity, and inclusion, these little commies within your office. They ordered regular meetings imploring them to, quote, start talking about race. Because apparently the way to fight racism is to become racist under DEI, right? To start looking at race, that you shouldn't be blind to race, they claim. He notes further in that monthly dialogues were ordered for women of color and men of color because apparently being white is not colorful. And they add that non-binary people of color were included too. These initiatives, bolstered by a $1 million grant from the NPR Foundation, came from management from the top down. And notes, crucially, they were in sync culturally with what was happening at the grassroots among producers, reporters, and other staffers. Most visible was a burgeoning number of employee resources or affinity groups based on identity. Now look, my take. It seems what happened behind closed doors at NPR is what was happening just about everywhere. It was happening in the government. It was happening within different agencies. In fact, Joe Biden has embedded that. He has now institutionalized this type of racist brainwashing, I would call it. Remember, Trump coming into office made a lot of outlets and organizations transform into activists. They had to hire these DEI agents. They had to transform their culture. Race narratives, gender narratives, sexual orientation narratives, whatever you want to call it, all these things became embedded within just about every major institution in the United States. And through that embedding of these organizations within the walls of just about every major organization, these organizations transformed into activist groups. They followed their activism regardless of facts. They followed it regardless of evidence. And of course, for a news organization, that's a big deal. Organizations within the media, right? You're just supposed to go based on evidence, not based on feelings. You're supposed to seek the truth and report the truth, to tell people what is most accurate and then let them judge how they feel about it based on the facts. But if you're an activist, you're not doing that. Now, I'll be talking more about what happened to the media establishment after a quick word from our sponsor.
Experts agree. One of the best ways to protect against financial uncertainty is to diversify your portfolio. Learn how physical gold and silver can secure your retirement funds from today's economic challenges. With a gold IRA from American Hartford Gold, you can safeguard your wealth with no penalties or taxes when you transfer your current qualifying retirement accounts. Call now and our precious metals specialists will send you a free information kit, no cost or obligation. American Hartford Gold, a trusted industry leader with an A+ from the Better Business Bureau, has a 5-star rating from thousands of happy clients. Whether you are getting physical precious metals in a gold IRA or delivered to your doorstep, we offer only the highest quality gold and silver. For your peace of mind, we also offer a no-fee buyback commitment, a low price guarantee, along with free shipping and free insurance. So don't wait. Call the number on your screen today and secure your financial future.
Welcome back. Ideological corruption has crept into the media establishment. Look, we saw this kick into high gear when former President Donald Trump came into office and the entire country seemingly lost its collective mind. When Trump was voted in, it made a lot of media outlets and news organizations transform into activists. They followed their activism regardless of facts, regardless of evidence. They were no longer engaging in normal reporting. They became activist organizations trying to advance preset agendas. News outlets were repeating fake news. Trump, Russia. Trump killed the koi fish in Japan. Donald Trump is trying to undermine democracy. All these fake narratives, right? Citing sources who were oftentimes lying to them, like Adam Schiff, for example. Lying to them for years, in fact. Or things like, again, the Trump-Russia hoax. And as they continued to lie to the American people, as they continued to double down on false narratives, they slowly lost touch with the basic tenets of journalism. Now, when George Floyd died and radical groups launched race riots all around the country, many of these same organizations, the news outlets, the big corporations, all of them, right? They started to adopt racial programs focused on things like race and gender and sexual identity and all these other things. And as part of that shift, they then started running programs to brainwash, attack, and shame anybody who refused to follow along with the opinions of the radicals. In other words, the most radical people within every news agency, within every office, gained the power and ability to target, suppress, attack, do whatever they wanted to anybody who didn't agree with them. That had the effect, again, of firing a lot of people, of getting people pushed out, or of just silencing anybody who was not even on the other side of the opinion, but even the moderates. That type of radicalization worked to institutionalize this activist culture within these organizations. News outlets became radical, brainwashed facilities. Big corporations adopted, again, DEI and so on. You see it in the markets. These organizations transformed fundamentally. People, again, who didn't want to follow them were pushed out. Many of them were fired. The country watched as the cancel culture mobs tried shaming and attacking anybody who refused to conform to the radical, racist, ironically, and absolutely insane narratives. Now, this form of internal brainwashing and ideological control then worked to transform businesses, government agencies, and yes, even newsrooms from within. Now, the Free Press notes this individual, again, this is the NPR editor, he says, but the role and standing of affinity groups, including those outside NPR, were more than that. They became a priority for NPR's union, SAG-AFTRA, an item in collective bargaining. He notes, the current contract in a section on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, requires NPR management to, quote, keep up to date with current language and style guidance from journalism affinity groups, and to inform employees if language differs from the dictates of those groups. In such case, he notes the dispute could go before the DEI Accountability Committee. Maybe if you call a man and a woman, you'll be guilty of ideological crime, right? The individual notes that in essence, this means the NPR Union, of which he said he's a due-paying member, has ensured that advocacy groups are given a seat at the table in determining the terms and vocabulary of our news coverage. In other words, the news coverage at NPR, according to this former editor, who was again suspended and then decided to leave after he wrote this and exposed it, he noted that again, because of this system, the advocacy groups, the radicals, were given a seat at the table to decide the news coverage and even the language that can or cannot be used at NPR. And you notice the conflicts between workers and bosses, between labor and management, they're common in news places, but you notice that NPR has had its share. But what's notable is the extent to which people at every level of NPR have become comfortably coalesced around the progressive worldview. They all either, again, followed it or just tolerated it, and they have to live under it now. The radicals have seized the building. The madhouse is controlled, again, by the people within, right? And this, he says, he believes, is the most damaging development at NPR. Quote, the absence of viewpoint diversity. What total irony, folks. The focus on diversity eliminated diversity. The people who preached tolerance were unable to tolerate any other views, any other opinions, any political stance that they did not agree with. That's your modern tolerance from these radicals, right? Not true tolerance, I'd say. And they became little ideological dictators within these institutions. Now, from the outside, look, you and I, we can all look at it and we can see how messed up it all was. But within these institutions, it seems like it had an even more destructive effect. And through this whole shift, the organizations started losing touch with normal people. Who would have thought, right? For companies, that means, losing business. You lose your customer base. People think, I don't want to associate with that brand, like Bud Light or Target, for example. For government, that means losing votes. Look at the polling numbers. People don't want to go along with these crazy radical things. Look, the Democrats are losing the Latino vote because the Democrats are trying to make them call themselves like Latin X and weird things like that. Who wants that? I don't think many people want it, right? And obviously the polling shows it. And for news agencies, this losing touch with ordinary people means losing the trust of your audience. Losing the credibility that's the backbone of the entire news agency. And look, without that, many of them had to start to follow the demands of the increasingly radical audience that still remained. Because they lost the moderates, they lost the sane people, they lost the people who still had basic reasoning. And the people they were left with were radicals and people who agreed with their crazy, far-out, fake news narratives. But look, that's actually not the worst of it. It's actually far from the worst. Now, this individual, this editor notes that NPR has just gotten a new CEO, Catherine Mayer. She doesn't come from a news background. She comes again from like Wikimedia and so on, like runs Wikipedia. But he said he was rooting for her to turn things around, to focus on fixing what went wrong at NPR and restoring the integrity of the news agency. But that's not what happened. Actually, it's the opposite of what happened. The NPR editor who wrote this piece, who called these things out, Mr. Uri Berliner, he was suspended without pay after this was published. They accused him of violating network policy for working for other news outlets because he published this op-ed or this expose at another outlet. Berliner then, of course, resigned, and that only brought more attention, ironically, to NPR and notably to its leadership, which is where the stories on the news CEO and her crazy background come into play. Now, Catherine Mayer is also the former head of the Wikimedia Foundation, which again runs Wikipedia, the go-to source of information on just about everything, right? And people started looking at her older tweets and some of the things she said, and this led to some pretty shocking findings. Government censorship programs, where they gave access to government agencies to change the foundation of facts within Wikipedia. Her claims about her wild views that truth isn't really truth, in fact. I'll explain this. Look, first came the concerns over just a far-left bias. Woke Spy said that back during the George Floyd riots of 2020, which killed dozens and caused billions in property damage, Mayer was furious. Again, the current NPR CEO was furious that the media would dare report on it. She said, quote, CNN is talking about the tragedy of damage to iconic retail zones and shoe stores in LA. I mean, sure, looting is counterproductive, but it's hard to be mad about protests not prioritizing the private property of a system of oppression founded on treating people's ancestors as private property. In other words, she's suggesting she has no problem with looting and burning and causing billions in property damage, and maybe, again, the riots even killing some innocent people. She continued saying, quote, "Also, reporting on extinguished shoe store fires is just lazy reporting. How dare people report on, again, the shoe stores being burned down?" And she notes, "Also, to be clear, I am not conflating provocateurs with protesters, instead saying this should not be the thing anyone sheds tears over." She says cheesecakes are insured. The right to be black and breathe is without measure. And again, we know that many of these individuals who had their stores burned down, the insurance companies didn't always fix them. And so, no, it wasn't always insured. Now, that's actually went further than this. The tweets and speeches and other things she did, they showed things to be a lot more serious, in fact. Her tweets and speeches revealed a radical picture of the new NPR CEO, and also, I think, flow beyond that. They show that this is a common problem that seeped its way into the media establishment as a whole, that kind of shine a light into what is taking place in the United States behind closed doors, of the radicalization that is spread throughout this country. This expose is starting a discussion about what has really been happening in this country, what caused it, the institutional bias that has come about within news agencies, government agencies, and the whole 9 yards, and even a public-private system of government colluding with private businesses to further enact this ridiculous, radical policy throughout the entire country. But folks, we'll be talking more about this only on EpochTV.com. That's our uncensored platform, where we report on things that corporate media don't wish for you to know. The scandal I've been talking about today shows exactly why corporate media cannot be trusted. So if you want real news you can trust and that show the news as it is, join us again on EpochTV.com, EPOCHTV.com. Link in the description below. And we've dared to cover stories that outlets and other places won't touch, including, for example, the real origins of the coronavirus, who is really pulling the strings behind the border crisis, and how the Chinese Communist Party is looking to take down America, and many, many other stories, including stuff on January 6th. So if you want news you can trust, and again, all the stuff that they tried covering up, we've actually exposed, and that, again, we're a news outlet not trying to push a radical agenda on you. You can go to EpochTV.com. Before we jump, let me show you a trailer of exactly what I'm talking about. One of my documentaries, The Final War, the CCP's 100-year plan to defeat America, covers exactly what the Chinese Communist Party is planning to do to take down the United States. And this is a hugely important story that does not get a whole lot of airtime in other media. But we cover it in depth. So for those of you on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Rumble, if you want to watch this documentary, click on the link in the description below, and I'll see you on EpochTV.com for the rest of this episode.
The greatest threat facing the United States is the CCP.
The Epoch Times investigation team had studied the CCP for years, but what we uncovered was yielding evidence beyond our imagination.
With Chairman Mao, with the Prime Minister, our talks have been characterized by frankness.
The Clinton administration said, "Oh, don't worry about it. This will be a poison pill for China."
China's strategic goal is to make sure that the U.S. has 4 enemies, and one of them must be a terrorist group.
We are giving of our life's blood so that the Chinese Communist Party can survive and thrive.